The wind tore through Dry Creek like a wolf with no prey. It howled between the clappered buildings, lifting dust, rattling signs, and seeping cold into every crack of wood and bone. Snow hadn't yet come, but the air had teeth, sharp, biting, unrelenting. On the edge of town, near the blacksmith's forge, a figure shivered beside a stack of discarded lumber. Bare feet, thin arms, eyes too old for a child. The boy sat still, wrapped in nothing but torn cloth and stubborn silence. Thomas Garrison hammered at the anvil, each blow echoing like a drumbeat through the quiet street. His hands, calloused and strong, didn't pause when he saw the shape in his periphery. He kept working, kept listening. And when the clang of metal gave way to a softer sound, a cough, a whimper, he looked up. A child. Apache, no more than 10. Dirt smeared his cheeks. Lips cracked from cold. But it was the boy's eyes that made Thomas stop. Dark, unwavering, filled with the kind of quiet that comes from seeing too much too soon. Thomas said nothing. He went inside, fetched a piece of bread from the hearth, still warm from morning. When he returned, the boy hadn't moved. He walked over, squatted beside him, and held out the bread. The boy hesitated. Hunger and pride fought a battle behind his eyes. Then, slowly, a small hand reached forward, snatched the bread and pulled it close like a treasure. The boy ate with the focus of someone who didn't know when the next bite would come. Thomas watched him, not with pity, but with a strange flicker of familiarity. He'd seen that same hunger during the war, in the eyes of orphans, in his own reflection. "You got a name?" Thomas asked. Silence. "All right," he said, standing. "You're welcome to the heat, long as you don't steal nothing." He went back to his forge, stoked the fire higher, and didn't look back. But he left the door to the workshop cracked open, just wide enough for a boy to slip through. An hour passed. The hammer rang steady. Then came the soft creak of a door and the quietest of footsteps. The boy sat near the forge, not too close, but within reach of the warmth. He curled into himself, eyes never leaving the flame. By dusk, Thomas handed him another piece of bread. Still no words, but the boy nodded this time. Dry Creek was the kind of place where everyone noticed everything, and by morning, whispers had already started to spread. If you want more powerful stories from the Old West, subscribe now for more gripping tales every week. You won't want to miss what happens next in Dry Creek. Thomas Garrison didn't ask where the boy came from. He didn't ask why he was alone, or what had driven him across the frigid plains to a town that barely tolerated his kind. In the West, questions like that usually led to stories soaked in blood, and Thomas had heard enough of those to last a lifetime. He let the boy stay by the forge through the next day, occasionally handing him scraps of bread or jerky. The child moved quietly, almost invisibly, never touching anything that wasn't offered. When townsfolk passed by and glanced through the open doorway, Thomas said nothing, but the looks lingered longer each time. The boy didn't speak, but his eyes watched everything, especially the forge, the fire, the tools, the rhythm of hammer and steel. Thomas noticed him mimicking the movements with a stick when he thought no one was looking. There was a spark of fascination in the way the boy studied each blow, each turn of metal. It stirred something in Thomas, a long-buried memory of his own son, gone so many winters ago. His name had been Eli. Hair like straw, hands always dirty, laugh too loud. Eli had wanted to be a blacksmith too, but Eli was gone. Buried in Kansas soil beside his mother, both lost to fever while Thomas served in the war. He shook the thought away. Memories were a dangerous fire, safer to keep them banked. That afternoon, a man in a brown coat knocked on the wooden post outside. Sheriff Delaney, tall, sharp-jawed, the kind of lawman who didn't waste words. "You know folks are talking," Delaney said, not unkindly. "Let 'em," Thomas replied without looking up from his work. "They'll do more than talk if that boy's still here come Sunday." Thomas set his hammer down, slow and deliberate. "He's not bothering anyone. He's an Apache, Thomas. You know what happened at Willow Creek last spring. Folks lost kin. And that boy didn't hold the rifle that killed them." "Doesn't matter," Delaney said. "Fear don't need a reason." Thomas stared at him a long moment, then nodded once. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. The sheriff tipped his hat and walked off. That evening, Thomas brought out a wool blanket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. The child flinched but didn't pull away. Thomas crouched beside him and said, "You remind me of someone." The boy looked up, his gaze meeting Thomas's, still silent, but no longer empty. There was something building there, a connection, thin as thread, strong as steel. By morning, the whispers in Dry Creek turned to murmurs. Some called Thomas brave, others called him foolish, and a few, like Harlan Briggs, called him traitor. But Thomas didn't care. The boy was still there, sitting by the forge, eyes fixed on the flame, as if trying to understand the language of fire. The days passed slowly, like smoke drifting above the rooftops of Dry Creek. Winter deepened, bringing with it hard frosts and harder hearts. The boy, still silent, remained near the forge, always watching, always learning. Thomas began calling him Nantan. It wasn't his name, at least the boy never said, but it meant leader in Apache, and it seemed to suit him. Nantan never asked for anything. He ate what was given, slept curled by the dying embers, and watched the blacksmith's every move with unblinking intensity. When Thomas pumped the bellows, Nantan mimicked the rhythm. When Thomas swung the hammer, Nantan traced the same motion in the air with a charred stick. It was like he was learning a language with no words, one written in sparks and steel. One evening, Thomas offered him a scrap of iron. Just a lump, no instruction. Nantan turned it over in his hands, held it to the fire, studied how it changed. He didn't try to shape it, just understood it. The boy was studying the forge the way a hawk watches the wind. But outside the walls of the workshop, tension was thickening like smoke before a blaze. Harlan Briggs stood on the porch of the saloon, arms folded, eyes narrowed at the forge across the street. He was a big man with a booming voice, a former cattleman who'd lost his brother in a raid 3 years back. And Briggs didn't forget. "That blacksmith's got an Injun sleeping under his roof," he said loudly one afternoon. "You all see it, just sitting there by the fire like he owns the place." A few men nodded, others looked away. Briggs wasn't satisfied with silence. He went door to door, whispering in ears, gathering signatures. Said it wasn't about hate, just safety. Said they couldn't risk another Willow Creek. That if one Apache boy was in town, more might follow. Sheriff Delaney caught wind of it, but he didn't interfere. Not yet. Inside the forge, Thomas sharpened an axe head, while Nantan cleaned the ash from the corner without being told. They worked in unspoken rhythm like two parts of the same machine. Thomas noticed how the boy handled the tools, careful, precise, patient. It reminded him of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. As twilight fell, Thomas walked to the churchyard to visit his family's graves. He stood there, hat in hand, wind tugging at his coat. When he returned, he found Nantan sitting beside the anvil, the fire low, the forge silent. Thomas sat down beside him. "Eli used to sit like that too," he said quietly. "Always staring into the flame like it had answers." Nantan didn't reply, but he reached into his pocket and handed Thomas a tiny coil of blackened wire he'd twisted himself. Clumsy, ugly, but unmistakably crafted. Thomas took it, turned it in his fingers, and gave a slow nod. "That's a start." The wind shifted that night, not in the trees or the sky, but in the town's breath. Dry Creek felt different, tight, coiled, the kind of silence that settles before thunder. Thomas sat by the dim forge, sharpening a broken horseshoe, while Nantan dozed under a thick wool blanket nearby. The coals pulsed red, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the streets were empty, too quiet. Then came the creak of wood, the soft crunch of boots in dirt. Thomas heard it. 3 sets of footsteps, no voices, too cautious to be drunkards, too steady to be townsfolk on a stroll. He set the horseshoe down and reached for the hammer, not the smithing one, but the short-handled war hammer he kept hidden behind the anvil. The door shuddered once, a hand testing the latch. Thomas stood slowly. "Who's there?" he called, voice low but firm. Silence. Then the door burst inward. 2 men rushed in, Briggs in front, face flushed with drink and anger, and a younger one behind him holding a length of chain. Another figure lingered outside, watching. Briggs raised a rifle, not aiming, just threatening. "You're gonna give him up, Garrison. Ain't no place for savages in this town." Thomas stepped forward, hammer in hand. "He's a boy, Harlan." "He's a scout," Briggs spat. "They send kids like that to mark our homes. You know it. You fought in the war." "I did," Thomas said, "which is why I know fear makes fools of men." Briggs moved closer. "You're protecting a murderer's blood. And you're about to cross a line you won't come back from." Behind them, Nantan stirred. He didn't scream, didn't cry, just watched. Then, as Briggs lunged toward Thomas, the boy moved. From his blanket, he grabbed a fire poker still glowing at one end. In one swift motion, he hurled it. It spun through the air and struck the floor beside Briggs with a shower of sparks, close enough to singe his coat. Briggs stumbled back, startled. The younger man cursed and fled. The third one outside took off running. Only Briggs stood there, breathing hard, eyes wild. Thomas raised the hammer. "Try it," he said. Briggs looked at the boy, then at Thomas. The firelight danced on their faces, one calm, one ready. After a long beat, Briggs lowered the rifle. "You've made your choice," he growled. "Hope you can live with it." He left without another word. The forge fell quiet again. Thomas turned to Nantan, who stood now, alert but calm. He met the boy's gaze and nodded once. "How you've got steel in you," he said softly. Nantan didn't smile, but his shoulders straightened. Outside, wind howled through Dry Creek's alleys, but inside the forge the flame held steady. And for the first time since winter began, Thomas felt something warm settle in his chest. Not just fire, but resolve. The morning after the break-in, the forge was quiet. Ashes sat cold in the hearth. The anvil untouched. Thomas stirred from his cot, reached for the kettle, but paused. The blanket near the fire was empty. He checked the back door, still locked. He searched the alley. Nothing. Nantan was gone. A tightness gripped his chest, the kind that spoke of more than worry. It was loss again, raw, familiar, and fast. He found footprints in the snow, small, deliberate, heading northeast out of town. Not toward the trail, but into the wilds. No hesitation in the steps, like the boy knew where he was going. Thomas didn't stop to ask why. He packed a satchel, loaded his old Springfield rifle, saddled his mule, and followed the tracks out of Dry Creek. The air was bitter, but he moved fast. Past the tree line, the world fell silent, only the wind and the crunch of hooves in snow. Nantan had traveled hard, no weaving, no rest. The tracks were sharp, steady, fresh. Hours passed. Hills rose, then flattened. Ravens circled overhead. At one point, Thomas spotted a scrap of cloth snagged on a branch, Apache pattern. His gut tightened. He pressed on. As the sun began to dip behind the ridges, the trail veered into a narrow canyon lined with pines. Thomas dismounted and walked the last mile on foot, careful, rifle slung, but ready. Then he saw the smoke. Thin, blue, curling from behind a rocky bluff. He crept forward. Beyond the bend lay a clearing tucked deep into the hills. Tents stood in a loose circle. A fire burned at the center, low and steady. Shadows moved, silent, watchful. An Apache camp. Thomas stepped into view slowly, hands raised. The noise of his boots in snow drew every eye. The entire clearing fell still. Nantan stood near the fire, unharmed. A taller figure stepped beside him, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick buffalo cloak, eyes sharp as obsidian. Thomas didn't move. Didn't reach for the rifle. He met the tall man's gaze, calm and steady. The warrior said nothing at first, just studied him. Then, in accented English, "You followed the boy." "I did." "You bring others?" "No." "You bring steel." Thomas let the rifle fall from his shoulder and set it gently on the snow. "I came for him," he said. "No lies, no threats." A long silence passed. The flames snapped. Then the warrior nodded once and spoke something in Apache. Nantan walked forward, stopped beside Thomas, looked up, and said the first word Thomas had ever heard from his mouth. "Uncle." Thomas looked back at the tall man. Understanding settled like the falling snow. This wasn't a rescue, it was a return. And Thomas was now standing at the heart of a place few white men ever reached, an Apache camp in winter, by invitation or by fate. The clearing remained silent long after Nantan's voice faded. Eyes watched from behind tents, behind braids and painted faces. Thomas stood tall, boots planted in snow, unarmed and surrounded. The tall warrior stepped forward. His presence carried weight, not just of authority but of story, loss, strength, command. His gaze flicked to the rifle still lying in the snow, then back to Thomas. "You are the one who gave my sister's son bread." Thomas gave a single nod. "Didn't seem right to let a boy starve." The man grunted. "Right and wrong, your people use those words often." Thomas kept his tone level. "And yours don't?" "We use truth." He paused, then added, "I am Kona." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "Thomas Garrison." A silence stretched between them like taut wire. Kona finally gestured to the fire. "You will stay the night. You will eat." Thomas hesitated, then nodded once more. He was led to the fire where a blanket was thrown over his shoulders and a piece of cooked rabbit handed to him. The warmth seeped into his skin like forgiveness. Nantan sat beside him, close, not speaking, but present. His eyes had softened. Kona sat across the flames. "My sister died last winter. Fever," he said simply. "She died with no food in her stomach and a son to protect." Thomas chewed in silence. He went into the White Lands alone. "I did not know if he would return. I did not know if I would see him again." "You have now," Thomas said. Kona's eyes flicked up. "Because of you. I didn't do much. You did what no one else did." The fire cracked. Sparks rose. Kona leaned forward. "Why?" Thomas looked at the flame, at the boy beside him, then back. "Because I've buried a son. Because I know what it's like to see the world turn its back on someone too small to fight it. And because I don't care what color his skin is. He was hungry. That's enough." Kona stared at him, face unreadable. Then he nodded. That night, Thomas lay beside the fire under buffalo hide, listening to drums in the distance. He wasn't a prisoner, but neither was he free. He was a guest of a people that carried grief in their blood and fire in their bones. And though few words had passed, something had shifted. When dawn came, Nantan brought him water. Then, wordlessly, pressed a small carved token into Thomas's hand, shaped like a flame etched with lines that told stories he couldn't yet read. Thomas didn't ask what it meant. He just closed his fingers around it, nodded to the boy, and stood to face the rising sun over a land that had never been his, yet felt strangely familiar. The sun rose over the canyon, bathing the camp in amber light. Smoke drifted gently from the cook fires as morning came slowly to life. Thomas sat by the embers, turning the carved flame-shaped token in his hand. Its surface was smooth, warm from his grip. He didn't know the meaning of its markings, but he felt the weight of its intent. Kona joined him quietly, settling beside the coals. For a moment, they both watched the fire, saying nothing. "Do your people believe in signs?" Kona asked finally. Thomas shrugged. "Some do. I think most just don't know how to read what's in front of them." Kona poked at the ashes with a stick. "The boy found you. That is a sign. A sign something is shifting." Thomas looked across the camp where Nantan was helping gather wood. He moved with purpose. Confidence. He looked nothing like the silent, frozen child Thomas had found outside the forge. "He's strong," Thomas said. "He is his mother's son," Kona replied. "She fought when our men could not. She bled for her people, and when she died, he did not weep." He walked. Thomas was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I named my son Eli. He died while I was away at war. Fever took him and his mother in the same week." Kona turned to him, listening. "When I came home, the house was empty. No sound, no warmth, just echoes. So I went west, built a forge, hammered until I could sleep." They sat in silence again, bound by stories too heavy for many words. At midday, the women brought them food: smoked deer, dried corn, warm flatbread. Thomas thanked them. One nodded, a rare gesture of acceptance. Later, near the edge of camp, Nantan approached, holding something small wrapped in leather. He opened it in front of Thomas. A knife, not steel, but stone, perfectly chipped, the handle wrapped in sinew. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out an object he hadn't touched in years, a folding pocket knife, worn, battered, but still sharp. It had belonged to Eli. He placed it in Nantan's hands. The boy stared at it, then at Thomas, and gave a single deep nod. That night, Thomas stood at the edge of the camp, preparing to leave. Kona met him there, arms crossed, face carved in moonlight. "You could stay," he said. Thomas smiled faintly. "I don't belong here." Kona didn't argue. "But now you carry our fire." Thomas held up the carved token. "I'll keep it close." They clasped forearms, warrior to warrior. Thomas turned, mounted his mule, and rode back into the darkness, alone, but not empty. He didn't know what he'd find waiting in Dry Creek. But he knew this much. The boy he had given bread to was no longer a shadow hiding from the cold. And Thomas Garrison was no longer just a blacksmith. Dry Creek woke to a strange stillness. The blacksmith's forge stood quiet in the gray morning light. Smoke had not yet risen from its chimney. A few townsfolk wandered the main road, bundled in coats, wary eyes scanning the horizon. Sheriff Delaney sipped coffee on the porch of his office, jaw tight, unease pressing on his chest like storm air. Then someone shouted. He turned. From the ridge beyond the eastern pass, a line appeared, dark shapes moving in rhythm. Horses, riders, dozens of them. 50 Apache warriors rode into Dry Creek without sound. They didn't shout, didn't draw weapons, just came, one after the other in tight formation, faces painted, spears raised, eyes steady. They rode through the center of town and stopped, every one of them, in front of the blacksmith shop. The townspeople froze. Windows slammed shut, doors locked. Someone screamed. Delaney grabbed his rifle. Men gathered quickly near the saloon, some in long johns, others half-dressed, but all armed. Harlan Briggs led them, red-faced and breathing heavy. "This is it," he barked. "I told you this would happen." Inside the forge, Thomas stood by the door, unarmed. He'd returned late in the night, lit the fire, and waited. Now he stepped outside, calm as still water. Kona dismounted first. Behind him, warriors remained motionless, hands near weapons, but none drawn. Delaney approached, rifle half raised. "Thomas, you all right?" Thomas nodded. "I'm fine." "What the hell is this?" Briggs spat. "You brought this on us." Kona ignored him. He walked to Thomas, unwrapped a bundle from his saddle, and laid it on the ground. Inside, dried venison, leather tools, herbs, and obsidian blades. An offering, a gesture of respect. Then Kona stepped back. Thomas knelt, picked up the bundle, and held it to his chest. He turned to the crowd. "They came to repay a kindness." Briggs stepped forward, finger raised. "This is a threat. This is a warning." "No," Kona said. His voice was low but carried. "This is thanks." Nantan rode up beside him, small but proud. He looked directly at Thomas, then at the people of Dry Creek. No fear in his eyes. Delaney lowered his rifle. "They're not attacking." "Not today," Briggs hissed. "No," Thomas replied, "not ever, if we treat them like men." Silence followed. The warriors didn't move. Then Kona raised his hand, and all at once the Apache turned their horses and began to ride out. No shots fired, no words shouted, only hoofbeats fading into the hills. But something had changed. A people who were once ghosts had stood, not in vengeance, but in honor. And the forge, once just a place of smoke and steel, had become something more. The dust hadn't yet settled when the first voice broke the silence. "I never seen 'em leave like that," murmured old Emmett from the general store porch. "No blood, no war cries. Just the quiet strength of a people honoring a man who had given their child bread." Sheriff Delaney approached Thomas slowly. "You understand what just happened?" Thomas nodded. "They offered peace, not in words, in presence." "Some folks might not see it that way," Delaney warned. Thomas looked toward the saloon, where Briggs stood stiff with fury, eyes darting, fists clenched. "Some folks will never see," he said. Doesn't mean the rest of us have to stay blind. Delaney gave a short grunt, then walked away without argument. Later that day, Thomas returned to his forge. The bundle from Kona sat on the work table, untouched. He opened it again, slowly this time. Every piece told a story. A finely carved pipe, a pouch of cedar bark, obsidian blades so sharp they caught the light like mirrors. But what caught his breath was a strip of deerskin with a single word burned into it: Fire Brother. He ran his hand over the marking. It wasn't a title, it was a bond. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, people began to gather near the blacksmith shop. Not many at first, just a few who had seen the look in Nantan's eyes, who had felt something shift in the air. Curiosity, maybe, or courage. Miriam, the schoolteacher, brought blankets for Nantan. She didn't speak, just set them down near the forge and nodded at Thomas. A farmer offered meat. Someone else brought tobacco. One by one, walls cracked. Nantan, who had once hidden in silence, now moved freely through the shop. He wasn't loud, but he was present. He helped Thomas sort tools, pumped the bellows without being asked, even sharpened a chisel with care. The forge roared higher that night than it had all winter. Briggs didn't return. His voice, once so loud, had lost its hold in the face of something older and stronger than fear: dignity. When Thomas closed the shop, he found Nantan waiting near the anvil. The boy held something in his hands, a small strip of iron he had hammered into a rough circle, a bracelet, crude, imperfect, beautiful. Thomas took it, slid it over his wrist, and nodded. "You'll be a smith," he said. Nantan didn't smile, but his eyes lit with quiet pride. In the streets beyond, Dry Creek breathed differently, slower, softer. Our town that had once feared the fire now saw what it could forge, not just tools, but something lasting. Peace. And it had begun not with treaties, nor with speeches, but with a man who gave a boy bread on a cold morning. Spring crept into Dry Creek on quiet feet. Snow melted into muddy paths. The river ran faster, and with it something else flowed, an understanding, fragile, but growing. The forge stayed lit through it all. Smoke curled skyward every morning. Hammer met steel with steady rhythm, and beside Thomas, Nantan stood, not a guest, not a shadow, but an apprentice. Word spread, not just through town, but beyond. Apache riders came again, not in formation but in pairs or threes bearing goods, furs, tools, dried roots. Some came to trade, others came just to watch. And the townsfolk no longer hid behind shutters. Trade routes reopened, a rhythm formed. Every week a few came from the hills, and a few from Dry Creek went out. No one called it peace, but no one called it war. One afternoon, Nantan took a red-hot horseshoe from the fire and shaped it without instruction. His form was true, his grip was firm. Thomas stood back, arms crossed, saying nothing. When Nantan finished, he plunged it into water, steam rising in a hiss. Thomas nodded. Good. The boy's chest rose slightly with pride. That night, Thomas sat at his workbench, staring at the flame-carved token Kona had given him. He'd placed it above the forge where his customers could see it, but few understood what it meant. He didn't mind. It wasn't for them. One customer, a passing trapper, asked what it was. Thomas simply replied, "A reminder." The man didn't press, and so life unfolded. Slow, honest, earned. One evening, as dusk settled, Nantan placed 2 iron shapes on the table, small birds, cut and bent with care. Thomas picked one up, smiled and placed it on the shelf beside Eli's pocket-knife. Memories didn't fade, but they hurt less. Nantan had never asked to stay. He never needed to. The forge became his just as much as Thomas's. He learned to speak more over time, not much, but enough. "Fire listens," he said once, unprompted. "It remembers." Thomas smiled. So do we. That spring, for the first time, Dry Creek held a shared feast. Settlers and Apache gathered near the riverbank. No guns, no suspicion. Just meat, music, and laughter. Not perfect, but real. Thomas watched it all from a distance, beside Nantan, who sat cross-legged with a carving knife, shaping wood with calm hands. "If you want more stories like this one," Thomas might have said, "tales where fire forges more than steel, subscribe now," because this wasn't just a story of a blacksmith and a boy. It was a story of how the smallest kindness can echo through hills and hearts: a loaf of bread, a warm fire, and the courage not to turn away. If this tale moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the next video on your screen to hear how a gambler, a preacher, and a stolen Bible changed a town forever.